All right. So when we're thinking about the games that people play, the ones that we've covered as well, generally cooperation is going to result in a higher payoff for everyone. And so what we want to think about is how the players in a game can actually change the rules they face in order to increase cooperation. So one mechanism we've already talked about for increasing cooperation is repeated play. So the more that I interact with someone, the more likely I am to cooperate because I'm anticipating that I'm going to have to play a game with them again, right? Whether that's be in a class with them, whether that is um, share a resource, work in a group project, whatever that might be. So that repeated play is more likely to discipline my choices such that I cooperate rather than defect. Um, as we've discussed, repeated play, however, is not a perfect mechanism, right? If someone knows when the last time they'll be interacting with someone is, that is going to cause cooperation to unfold, right? The game is going to unravel such that it's less likely that cooperation occurs to begin with. Right? However, like I mentioned briefly as we were discussing the centipede game, there are some other mechanisms that often exist alongside repeated play that cause cooperation to be higher than predicted, even in games that are finitely repeated, right? Meaning they don't go on forever. In particular, these are going to be reputation, right? So reputation mechanisms as well as social norms, all right? So if you think about your behavior in group projects, right? Group projects are notorious for one person at minimum defecting, right? They don't do as much work, they don't contribute equally as the other person. When we see group projects work well, it's when the two people are in the same major and are anticipating having to work together going forward, right? Or they have some other relationship in which they're anticipating continued interactions that's going to discipline their choices. These are usually referred to as reputation mechanisms, right? If I am engaged in a group project with my friend, I don't want my friend to think poorly of me, right? I want to maintain my good reputation that I have with that person. And so I'm going to be more likely to cooperate and contribute than I would be if I were doing the project with someone who I had never met before and didn't have much of a relationship with beyond just school. And another mechanism that we see play out, especially in group projects, is social norms, right? So there's this norm of fairness, there's this norm of cooperation, there's this norm of politeness that we all adopt as part of our interactions just in the greater world, right? Day to day, you interact with a number of strangers, right? Maybe a barista at a coffee shop or a cashier at a grocery store. And usually, right, we're polite to those people. Even though we don't anticipate ever interacting with that person again, we're still polite, right? And the reason for that is we do anticipate interacting in a market again, right? And the markets work better, the experience is more pleasant if everyone is polite. And so that, anonymous stranger that is checking out your groceries for you, who you're thinking, likely you'll never see again, they are sort of a stand-in for everyone else you might interact with in a given market, right? So those norms of politeness, congeniality that we bring, that we use in a market, we often bring into other games. So when economists do experiments to test out these different games, the ones we've covered as well as others, they often see that people cooperate much more than game theory predicts, because game theory doesn't allow for these additional rules to come into play, right? They assume that as soon as the person walks into the game in the experiment in the lab, they let go, they lose all of their previous experiences and conventions that they follow in other parts of their life, which of course is not true, right? Which is why we see the outcomes that they observe differing so dramatically from their predictions. Some other ways that not firms, players can increase cooperation is through things like credible commitment or compensation. So if we think about the incumbent game, the incumbent could keep the entrant from ever entering by credibly committing to producing a high amount of output, right? We can just go back. We saw that the um, entrant only wants to come in when the incumbent produces a low amount of output. If the incumbent produces a high amount of output, that entrant actually earns losses, right? So what the incumbent could do is credibly commit to producing a lot of a good. And the way that they're going to do that is by investing in their production capacity. They're going to say very clearly, I can produce a lot of output and I'm going to, right? While they're in the market on their own, right? They likely are producing a lot amount of output because they're not sharing the market with anyone. And so through credibly committing, having those factories, having those capabilities, the incumbent commits to saying, even if you're here, I'm producing a lot, that's going to keep the entrant out, right? It changes the game such that the low production branches are not even an option anymore. And so when faced with that trade-off, either earn nothing or earn a loss, our entrant is going to choose to stay out of that market. Okay. Our final mechanism that we want to talk about here is compensation. So compensation can pretty effectively um, facilitate cooperation, increase cooperation, because what happens is one of the players says, if we choose this option, choose this play that usually would not benefit you, my opponent, I will pay you out of my earnings such that it does benefit you. Okay, so through that real compensation, players can change the equilibrium outcome of a game. All right, let's take a look at our sort of shortened version of the centipede pay game. Excuse me. What might happen is, absent any additional mechanisms, what we are going to expect is for player one to select play, because that way they guarantee they get some payoff. Because what they anticipate is if they pass, player two is going to play, so that player two gets 12, but player one's going to get nothing. Right? So what we might see is that player one says, if I pass and player two, you pass, I will pay you from my winnings. So I will pay you maybe two, whatever that is, dollars, whatever, such that your payoff now becomes 13 and mine is 9, right? So that 9, 13 payoff is preferable to both, right? Player 2 prefers the 13 over the 12, and player 1 prefers the 9 over the 0 or 1 that is otherwise available to them. So that compensation is going to effectively move the equilibrium to pass, such that player 1 gets 9 after they compensate player 2, and player 2 gets 13. Okay. And I've shown you that here on the slide again, right? So you can see, right, how these payoffs would fall out in the instance where player 1 relies on compensation to change the game's equilibrium. All right. Here is the credible commitment mechanism that I discussed before, right? What the incumbent is going to do is produce a large amount of output, right? They're going to expand their production capacity such that the entrant doesn't want to even enter the market to begin with. Okay, and so what we're going to see is that the payoffs will change. So now I've just changed that single payoff for the incumbent. They've invested in this high capacity, so if they produce a low amount, they're not going to be earning as much, benefiting as much as they would be if they produce a lot. And so that means that if the entrant enters, then our incumbent is going to choose to produce a lot, just like if the entrant stays out, our incumbent is going to choose to produce a lot. So again, those low output options are essentially made irrelevant. Okay. And that way, through that credible commitment, the incumbent ensures, the entrant knows that they're going to produce a lot if they enter, meaning that the entrant earns a loss. So the entrant just stays out. So our equilibrium becomes stay out and produce a lot. Okay. Let's look at another example of social norms. So my research is on prisons, so we're going to use a prison example here. So this prisoner's dilemma that we saw at the beginning of the lecture is one that people face in prison every single day, right? And before, right? So people in prison gangs are continually involved in this illicit behavior, and they have to have confidence that the people they're engaging in these crimes with will not rat them out to police, right? Um, that has been enforced historically through violence. If someone does rat out a fellow member, they face either a severe beating or often they're killed. And so what that means, right, we get that norm, snitches get stitches, right? Um, and what it looks like in our game is that the payoffs from cheating have changed, right? So now if we're in that cooperate cell, right, both of the hypothetical bank robbers are separated in their individual interview rooms. Neither's going to have the incentive to defect because now if they defect while the other cooperates, they are earning a very steep loss, right? They are going to get beat up once they're out on the street. They're no longer wanting to cheat. And in fact, if they cooperate while their opponent cheats, they get a reputation in their gang for being a good member, a trustworthy member, right? And so because now no one has the incentive to defect, that cooperate equilibrium becomes highly stable. And it's just through that norm of I know that if I rat out my partner, I might die. Right. And so even getting a little bit of a break in terms of incarceration time is not worth it. Right. Onto that, we can even add that within gangs, going to jail is also now considered sort of a badge of honor, right? It shows your commitment to the gang. It shows that you're doing what you're supposed to do, that you're sort of a ride and or die member. Okay. And then added to that, we often see people who are incarcerated and gangs themselves rely on reputation mechanisms so that they can signal their identity and their group membership, right? Tattoos are these. It's such that, and it lets folks know, okay, in this case, the person who's pictured here is part of La MA, and anyone who sees them knows that. And so the gang that itself is also going to have a reputation for how it interacts and trades with other gangs. And so that person encountering this individual is going to use the gang's reputation as a proxy for this person. And they're going to know that if the person behaves in conflict with that reputation, that person is going to face potential sanction, which means like getting beat up by their fellow gang members. And so that's the way that, in this way, prison gangs, much like businesses, sort of develop a reputation by continuing to have good quality interactions with trading partners, with customers, and providing good quality products, right? And so we see very clearly, actually, that prison gangs operate as a sort of in a sort of business-like structure. All right. Collusions we can think about as well because they are a type of prisoner dilemma game. We saw this in chapter 11. But basically, right, we walk through how Al and Bob might ensure that they both keep their promise and maximize their total payoff by reducing the number of shows they perform a week. And they can use a number of mechanisms to facilitate that change, right? And increase the payoffs to either keeping the promise or increasing the payoffs to cheat, right? Sorry, reducing the payoffs to cheat, so making it more costly to cheat. And so what I am going to leave for you all here to think about, and this will be an activity for you to do on Canvas, is think about what mechanisms might a hypothetical cartel, you can use Al and Bob as an example, what mechanism might they use to enforce cooperation? How might they ensure that their members do not cheat, right? And what needs to be true for that mechanism to be effective, right? Another example you can use is OPEC, right? Why has OPEC been stable for so long, whereas we usually see cartels dissolve quite quickly? All right. So with that, that's going to end our